Good afternoon, all. So my name's Lorraine Copes, and for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to share with you an exploration of how I expect the procurement landscape to change post-lockdown, specifically within the hospitality sector, but broadly within procurement. But before I start, I'm going to tell you a bit about myself and my background. And so for almost 20 years, I've worked within the hospitality sector, specializing within the multi-site operation side of things, working for brands such as the Gordon Ramsay Group, Shake Shack, TGI Fridays, and Elior Contract Caterer, to name a few. And within my roles, I have been responsible for building teams, creating supply chain infrastructure, and designing and delivering procurement strategy across the board. So currently head of procurement for a restaurant group called Corbin and King, and we operate 7 fairly diverse restaurants within London. And, just a bit more about me, actually. One of the reasons why I have loved and stayed within the hospitality sector for as long as I have is because it's relatable. I'm pretty sure for all of you, there will be a hotel, a pub, a restaurant that is close to your hearts and you have special memories within it. Similarly, when you invite a friend over for dinner, even though it's a long distant memory away now, that's hospitality. When you make a cup of tea for your partner, that's hospitality. And so whilst procurement is absolutely a common thread, hospitality is too. And so I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And so I'm going to take you briefly through my agenda. I'm going to remind you of a timeline of events. I'm going to give you some sector insights in terms of the sourcing global village. I'm going to review the immediate impact of COVID, take you through the disruption to businesses expected, what those procurement considerations look like off the back of this disruption. I'm going to then take you through my 4 essential steps to secure supply, and then I'm going to summarize, close, and open up questions to the floor. So a brief timeline of events then. So 29th of January, if you recall, first 2 patients within the UK test positive. On the 28th of February, the first fatality. The 20th of March, all restaurants, bars, and non-essential businesses were ordered to close by the government. And on the 14th of May, where we are here and now, is that there are a sizable proportion of restaurants that have actually reopened on a collection, delivery, or drive-through basis. For instance, Starbucks announced that today they would open a little over 10% of their estate to service our needs. Most hotels and pubs remain closed. And so businesses are closed. And so I want to give you some insight into some of our biggest category spends and where they're located globally. And I think the term of global village accurately sums up the reality for many supply chains across multiple industries. Hospitality supply chains are heavily dependent and interlinked on many countries around the world. To focus on the 5 largest purchase categories within the sector, being food, wine, uniform, tableware, and linen. All of the supply chains have obviously fallen victim to COVID, and so unraveling the impact of this global pandemic is sure to reveal the sheer fragility of these supply chains. And using food as an example, here within the UK, we import 50% of our food from a total of 160 countries, of which 30% comes from within the EU and 20% further afield. Naturally, the length of the supply chain and lead time will play its part in how quickly this disruption becomes visible. But for perishable goods, it has been almost immediate, presenting gaps and delays in the supply horizon. And so what has the actual immediate impact been? Labour, there is no sector exempt from the challenges on the Labour Department, but just due to the nature of this outbreak. For those services, though, that have continued to have to move forward despite COVID, including fruit and vegetable harvesting, where they were already actually suffering labour shortages as a result of Brexit. And they've been left even more exposed due to the lockdown and travel restrictions because they are heavily reliant on Eastern European labour, who obviously at this moment in time cannot travel. There's been huge amounts of PR to encourage British workers who may have been furloughed or made redundant to step in, but that obviously comes at a higher labour cost and without the skill levels of their typical workers and their workforce. So the summer season is actually upon us right here and now. And if the labour gap continues, there will be millions of tonnes of fruit and vegetable left unpicked or composted. And aside from that, we also have the labour force being diagnosed on a day-to-day basis. So numbers ultimately are down. We've now seen a real imbalance in the supply and demand that has hit our sector, because food being the single biggest cost of sale within the sector, the large amounts of perishable goods usually supplied into the hospitality sector was overnight left without a home. Again, millions of tonnes of livestock and produce had to be quickly diverted, or even worse, ended up in the bin. And the increase in demand seen within the retail sector, which has been reported to be around the 15 to 20% mark, it unfortunately doesn't account for the decline that suppliers have seen in business as a result of hospitality industry closures. A large number of food producers have actually diversified their businesses overnight, so supplying to end users such as ourselves. And that has really been an attempt to keep business afloat, but also finding a home for this product. There have been also actually a few good news stories of restaurant groups, of which there are many, who are now gearing up to service the NHS by providing meals to them on a day-to-day basis. And a particular business in particular that was set up by one of the founders of Leon and a couple of actors, they're currently delivering 40,000 meals per day to 88 hospitals nationwide, and they're using their premises and the produce to service the staff. So in addition to that, business levels obviously declining, social distance is in place, and those businesses, those manufacturers and producers, such as wholesale butchers, produce suppliers who are servicing the NHS and servicing restaurants offering delivery services and customers at home, have seen a rapid decrease in production capacity. So some that I work really closely with in particular have had to furlough staff or make them redundant because they're just simply unable to support the cost of doing business with the new guidelines and the new business levels. In terms of distribution, from a movement of goods perspective, Heathrow is the UK's largest port, and 34% of cargo comes via this route, but 95% of that is actually carried in passenger planes. So with a large proportion of planes that have now been grounded, redundancies have been announced recently by TUI, last week by Virgin. And those routes that have remained open have put immense amounts of pressure on the supply chain due to the demand of essential goods such as PPE. And so what we do know for sure is that uncertainty lies ahead. And if we were to categorize those into three clear buckets, it would start with operational change. And so social distancing will add a complication to the way of doing business within our sector. From receiving goods into the back door, the cook stations within the kitchen, how front of house interact with our guests, and how the tables within premises are positioned. Add to this, PPE, screens, and the way of doing business not only looks very different, but it really does heighten the operational complexity. As far as business diversification, limited for many businesses within our sector, but for restaurants, the obvious service addition is home delivery and collection. We could also be looking at adjustment in trading hours, service offering, and menu complexity. However, hotels and pubs rely on the guests wanting to travel half a mile or 100,000 miles, and so diversifying product and service offering has to be front and center for the individuals leading these businesses as they model what the new world could look like. So, in terms of commercial viability, we, the general public, have been cooped up at home for a number of months now, cooking more, the possible occasional takeaway. And for those of us that can afford to dine out once the hospitality sector is back up and running, it begs the question as to will the public choose to pick up where they left off, or would purchase and eating out behaviours change? Tourism, especially within London, will be a near minimal. So combining this with domestic diners paints quite a bleak picture of business levels, definitely not resembling the ones that we left. It was recently estimated that the current social distancing measures within a restaurant that currently has 100 covers would only cater for 30. Meaning an entirely new business model would have to be devised to calculate commercial viability of these new levels of business. So the equation of operational change plus business diversification plus revenue that remains will force many regional and national operators to make some really difficult decisions about the lost leaders within their business that consequently don't stand up in the new world. Now, growing sales during this climate will be extremely difficult, and so removing supply chain risk and controlling costs is critical now more than ever. And so what are the procurement considerations? Now, I've discussed already unpredictable business levels, completely inevitable, and it will require us to stay closer to the sales numbers or more close than ever before to quickly understand the new sale trends and as soon as they emerge. Global and local upheaval, the ease of accessing goods will ultimately shift. New sourcing needs, the government have now issued guidance for businesses operating, and with this has come not only PP equipment, but also redesign of the guest journey. Pre-existing agreements, volume-based agreements and service agreements will of course require review, and the force majeure clause will need to be exercised where absolutely necessary. Some of the suppliers simply won't make it. There will be supplier casualties, and there already have been many. And last but not least, price volatility. And so steps 1 to 5 will cause volatility within the marketplace, and as we all come to grips with the new supply and demand and the new supply routes and markets available to us. And so the 4 key pillars that I deem to be essential for procurement and supply chain to navigate these choppy waters for the short, medium and long term also assume that resources and processes are already in place to manage this. So the first is communication, and for me probably the most important of the 4, as it underpins all business at all times anyway. Cross-functional internal communications with operations teams to understand operational change from steps of service to the menu, along with forecasts on business performance, marketing from an alignment on customer messaging, and finance being critical just to allow us to devise the plans of action for trading term changes and cash flow adjustments. Existing supply relationships absolutely must be maintained, communication channels remaining open, and discussions ready to be had about the previously upheld terms of trade that will in the new world prove difficult to uphold. Initially, I am absolutely expecting longer lead times until we better understand what demand levels are. Product availability will absolutely shift and payment term discussions approached. The force majeure clause will need to be exercised within contracts that are no longer fit for purpose in the new world, and slight apprehensiveness to commit to new agreements in the short term. Number 2 is around transparency. And in order to truly understand and measure the risk within your supply chain, transparency is essential. And this must include the entire supply chain, including suppliers that are upstream, for this information to really be of value. And it will require supplier partners to be open and honest without feeling vulnerable about the information shared. Inventory obligations within the supply chain will need to be reforecasted. And examples of this within my sector would be for bespoke plateware, which are priced based on the optimum production quantities in accordance to the usage and buffer stock. Obviously, this equation would need to be completely reworked on the basis of the new usages. Recognizing that incumbent suppliers and business circumstances will have changed, and in some cases drastically, a supply chain health check assessing both financial and operational shifts in tandem will be critical in order to design the new and agile landscape. And product integrity and the monitoring of this will be crucial due to opportunists and food fraud increase when supply and demand is often out of kilter. Number 3 is around diversification of the supplier base, and it's long been viewed as suboptimal. However, with gaps certain to arise within the incumbent supplier base, diversifying the supplier base will reduce risk and increase supply options. Product availability is likely to lead in the sourcing priority list. But with cash flow tight for all parties, best pricing, service and quality remains imperative along with the supplier benchmarking, as it will always give us a good indication on if we are buying the best pricing under the current circumstances. And we also must be really mindful that this picture is likely to be ever changing in the short term. I personally hope to see suppliers coming together, collaborating and exploring ways to reduce costs to serve by working in partnership. Last but not least, technology. So when we think about digitalization and how it's assisted every industry, it's about efficiency, it's about speed, it's about disaster recovery and increasing productivity. Being able to digitally map our supply chains is not only going to help us find the best fit solutions right now, but also for any significant changes that are coming, with the most pressing being Brexit. For the small and medium restaurant groups within my sector, we do lag slightly behind many other industries from a system development perspective, but it doesn't make it impossible to map our supply chains. It's going to be essential to segment our supply chains so that we're attributing resource and time for core products into tiers. And it's also going to be essential for us to stay extremely close to the market with commodity data, which will help us drive purchasing decisions on both a micro and macro level. Monitoring is I can't stress how important this is going to be as we move forward, and that's monitoring of sales, of volumes, of trends, market conditions, and the supply chain itself. And collectively, we'll all best inform our decisions during this initial crisis management phase that we are entering. And so in summary, our supply chain heavily relies on global and local supply chains. The economy, business, and consequently the supply chain has been disrupted. Transparency and diversification will underpin our ability to source sustainably, and digitalization of our supply chains will protect us in the short and the long term.